Now, I have had a few questions about the opening titles of my videos. Specifically, how do I make those letters fall into their correct places? And to get there, we're going to use the rigid body system. There is a lot of repetition, and I'll go quite quickly towards the end, but as long as you can follow the steps to animate the D and the O, you should be able to make something like this in about 15 minutes. So let's add some text and take a look. I'll just delete the default cube, and I'll press Shift and A to add some text. I'm going to move the camera around, zoom in a bit, tab into edit mode, and I can delete the word text and add my own. Droppage. It is a word, I promise. Now tab back to object mode. I want to go to the text properties, which is this little A over here, and the first thing I want to do is change it to center alignment, just so that it's centered around my scene. Now I don't want to use the Blender default font, so I'm going to change that. I'm going to open up the font section and click on the little folder beside regular. In this box here, I'm going to go to the search window and press ARI. That'll do, and the one I want is Arial Black. Now I want to open up the geometry section and give it an extrude value of 0.05. I want to give the text a bit of a bevel because impossibly sharp edges are just horrible in any 3D. So I'm going to set the bevel to 0.005. Just gives the edges a little curvature to catch the light. And that's what makes things look real. Now that's good enough for the text. Let's add a floor. If we press Shift and A and add a mesh plane, I'm just going to scale it up, press S and 50. I'm just going to press F2 and rename this to floor. Now we're going to use the rigid body system, so I'm going to make this plane a rigid body by going to the physics tab and pressing rigid body. I'm going to change the rigid body type to passive, which just makes it a collision object. It won't be moved at all itself by the physics system. Now I'm going to set the floor to be unselectable. I don't want to be able to select it in the 3D view. It'll just get in the way. Now we want our text to sit exactly on top of this plane. And to do that, we're going to need to turn on snapping and change it to face snapping. Now with the text selected, I'm going to press G and Z. And you see it'll flick around, but the closer I am to the top of the screen, the more likely it is to go under the mesh, and the closer I am to the bottom of the screen, the more likely it is to sit on top of the mesh. Just left click to confirm when it's on top of the plane. Now I'm just going to quickly set up this scene so it looks a bit nicer. I'm going to press 0 to change to the camera view, and then in the view section of the end panel, I'm going to change to lock camera to view. Now the normal viewport opening and dollying controls will interactively change the camera's position. So I'll just move it into position here, then I'll turn off lock camera to view. Now I'm going to switch to rendered view, which at the moment is Eevee. And while I'm not going to use Eevee for the render, I'm actually going to change the settings because they also apply to the viewport shading mode, which we will use. So I'm going to turn off viewport denoising. I'm going to change the viewport sampling to 32. I'm going to turn on screen space reflections. I'm going to turn off half trace res and change the trace position up to 1. In performance, I'm going to change to high quality normals, and in shadows, I'm just going to change the cube size to 4096 and say high bit depth. These are all just very simple settings changes which I use almost every time. And now that they're set, both viewport shading and the rendered view will look the same. But what we're actually going to use is cycles. So now I'll change the render engine to cycles. Make sure it's on GPU compute. I'm going to add denoising to the viewport. I'm going to change the denoiser to optics. But I don't want the denoising to start until it hits frame 20, so I'm just going to change the start sample to 20. Everything will be moving, so I'm just going to turn on motion blur. Now I'm very quickly going to add an Hdri. I won't add the rotation controls to it, so I'll go to the shading tab. I will set it to rendered and just change it to the camera view there. And if I go to the world section of this drop down box, I can press Shift and A and add a texture, environment texture, plug its color output into the color input of the background. Open up my HDRI. Anyone will do. I'm just going to choose this one. Then we can change straight away back to the layout view. Let me quickly add a few simple materials. I'm just going to select the floor, which I have to do in the outliner now. Go to materials, add a new material for that. I'm going to change the base color to orange. I always seem to make everything orange these days. Must be the Blender influence. Just decrease the roughness a little. And that's fine for the floor. I'm going to select the text, add a new material for that. I'm going to leave it as white actually. And just turn the roughness all the way down. Now I'm just going to orbit the camera around to get out of camera view so I can select this light here. I want to change it to an area light. I'm just going to turn off snapping up here. I'm going to scale it by 50. And then I'm going to press G and press Shift and Z so it doesn't move along the Z axis. Move it to somewhere in front. Grab the little yellow circle on the light and just kind of point it at our text. I'm going to move it down in Z a little actually. And do that again. And then when I change back to the camera view, change it to 1500, and that looks fine. It's quite clean and modern. I might just select this and darken it down a little. Now I would like to turn off the wireframe of this light because it gives me this big black line and it feels it gets in the way, but it turns out there's no way to do this without turning off the display of the empties as well. We're going to have to put up with this black line. I wish someone would take a look at that. Anyway, let's get back to animating this text. Now I'm going to use something called the Align tools, which come with Blender, but they're not turned on by default. If we go to the Edit menu and Preferences, go to Add-ons, and in the search box just type Align, and the only thing that's there is Object Align Tools. So just click on the little square next to it and they will be enabled. And you'll be able to find them in the Item tab of the End panel. We'll use them in a moment. I'll just close that. Now first of all, I'm going to duplicate this text object. Press Shift and D, and I'm going to press F2 to rename that Editable Text. Call it whatever you want. I'm just going to turn off the 3 icons here. We won't be using it, it's just a good idea to keep copies of your objects at key stages in their development, and this is a useful stage to keep. Okay, now we're done with Blender's text system, so we need to convert this text to a mesh. So I'll go to Object, Convert, and Mesh, which converts it to a mesh object. Now straight away I'm going to go to the Object Data Properties, which is this green triangle, open up Normals, and turn on Auto Smooth. That's not something I would normally ever do in a model, but because this topology is so awful, it's the quickest way to make it look vaguely passable. Now I'm going to switch to Material Preview Shading while we work on this. With our settings it's close enough to the final look without having to watch cycles refine the render every time I make a small change. Now if I tab into Edit mode we can see this awful topology. It's best not to look at it too long, so while we're there let's fix one of the issues with Blender's text by pressing A to select everything, and press M to bring up the Merge menu and choose By Distance. And we can see down at the bottom here that that's got rid of 3,532 vertices. It's a lot. And we certainly don't want those. Our next job is to create separate mesh objects for each individual letter, which I can do by pressing P to open the Separate menu and choose By Loose Parts, which quickly does that for us. Now you can see all of the new meshes have appeared here in the outliner. Now if I tab back to Object mode with all of these letter meshes selected, I can go to Object, Set Origin, and Origin to Center of Mass, Volume, which moves each letter's origin to the center of its volume, which is what the rigid body physics system needs to work correctly. If you ever have problems with rigid body physics, it's usually because your origins are in the wrong place. Now just a note that I won't be renaming all of our meshes in this tutorial in the name of speed and to reduce the boredom for you watching, but that is very bad practice. Always rename every mesh as soon as it's created. Blender Bob will have me doing push-ups. Great, so we have our individual letters now, and I want them to fall from above and land exactly where they are now. And to do this, I'll use the rigid body system. But before we start, I just want to go to the Scene Properties, which is this cone icon, and open up the Rigid Body World section. It'll do a much better job if we change the sub-steps per frame and the solver iterations both to 20. Now I'm going to click on our first letter and press Shift and D to duplicate it. I want to move it up in Z, so I'll immediately press Z and type 10, which just moves it 10 units up. If I just select this one and zoom out, we can see it's way up here. I just select just that letter again. And I like to rotate each letter around one of the axes, just randomly to add a bit of interest to the animation. So I'm just going to type 5 in the X rotation to rotate it 5 degrees. Now I'm going to go to the Physics panel and click on Rigid Body to make it a rigid body. And I'm going to leave all of the settings at their default values. Now I'm going to make sure I'm at the first frame and press play to simulate it. And that looks great. I can stop it at any time. I don't have to wait until the playhead gets to the end of the animation, as long as it's settled. Now I'm going to press 0 to switch back to the camera view, have another look at that, and that looks great. But it doesn't fall exactly where it started, and we can't move it around while it's under the control of the rigid body system. We need to convert the physics motion to translation and rotation keyframes, and it's really simple to do this. If I just press F3 to bring up the command search box, I can type bake. The option we want is the second one here, Object, Rigid Body, Bake to Keyframes. So I just click on that, a new dialog box comes up, and we can just leave all these settings alone, so I'll just press OK again. And in a second or two, it's very quick, it will have turned off rigid body for this object and put all of these keyframes, which are these little diamonds in the timeline. There will be a keyframe at the very end, and I often just select this keyframe and delete it. You don't have to, but I just think it's neater. And that's great, but we still can't move this object around because it'll always snap back to its keyframe position whenever we press play. And now I see people going in and trying to manipulate the F-curves in the animation editor, but that's just crazy. There's no need to do that. All we need to do is parent this object to an empty, which we can move around, and that'll take the whole animation with it whenever it's repositioned. Now first I'm going to move the playhead in the timeline to somewhere after it is completely settled, after the block of keyframes. I'm going to shift and right click somewhere in the screen to move the 3D cursor somewhere better. It doesn't really matter where. So I'll press Shift and A to add an empty. I'm going to use the single arrow. You can use any of them. They're all the same. They're just displayed differently. And this adds it at the 3D cursor, but we need it to be at the position and orientation of our animated letter. And to do that, I can just shift and click this letter so that it's the active object with these two both selected. And if I go to the Item tab of the End panel, we'll see our Align tools. And I just need to press this large XYZ button to align both the location and the rotation of the empty to the animated letter. So now this empty is in the correct place, we can make it the parent of our letter, just by clicking the letter and then shift-clicking the empty, press Ctrl and P and select Object. Now, if I click on the empty so that it's the only thing selected, and then shift and click on the original unanimated mesh letter, again I can just press the XYZ button in the Align tools. And what that does is effectively invert all of the transformations and rotations from the end of our letter's animation, putting it back into place, but still keeping the simulated animation. If I just go to the start of the timeline, this one here is the unanimated, so I can just hide that from the viewport and the renderer, and if I press play, we'll now see that our letter falls down and falls exactly into place. And with our letter selected, we can see we have all these keyframes, and if I press A while I'm in the timeline, I can just press G and move them around, effectively changing the timing of the animation. I'm just going to right click to cancel that. We'll do that in a minute. And now we can more quickly do our second letter. So I'll select the R, press Shift and D to duplicate it, press Z, type 10. I'm going to rotate this one 10 degrees around X. I'm going to set it as a rigid body, make sure I'm at the first keyframe, press play, watch it simulate, and that looks great. I'll just stop it there, press F3. I just need to hit enter this time because it remembers the last command we used. Hit enter again to confirm these values, and in just a second it's created all of our keyframes. I'll just delete the last keyframe as before. Now I'll press Shift and A to add a single arrow empty, Shift and select our letter, press the XYZ button in the Align tools, then select our letter and Shift and select the empty and parent them together by pressing Ctrl P and selecting Object. Now if I select just the empty and then Shift and select the original letter, I can use the Align tools again and everything's moved into position. It's as simple as that. Go back to the first frame. This is the original letter, so I can just hide that again from the viewport and the render, and now when I press play they'll both fall down into position. So that's the R done. Let's move on to the O. I'm going to select it, duplicate it, move it up. I'm going to rotate this one around the axis, just 1 degree this time. Make it a rigid body, make sure I'm at the first frame of the animation, and press play to simulate it. And we'll see there's a bit of a problem with the O. It takes a very, very long time to settle, and that's because it's cylindrical. And the rigid body system struggles with cylindrical objects. And there are a few ways to change this, but the quickest one is just to go to Collisions and change Convex Hull to Box. Now if we go back to the first frame and resimulate, just by pressing play, that one will settle much more quickly. So again, I'll press F3, hit enter again, delete the last keyframe, add an empty, Shift and click our letter and move the empty over to it. Now parent these two together, then select just the empty by itself and Shift and select the original letter, press the XYZ in the Align tools again, go back to the start, hide that original letter, and we can press play and have a look at that. Now there may have been a little bit of a crossover between the R and the O there, so what I'm going to do is just select the O, press A to select all its keyframes, and just move it along a little way. And that should stop them colliding with each other. Let's have a look at that. That looks great. Now I'm going to go through the process for the rest of the letters very quickly, but you've already seen exactly how to do it. It's probably going to take 3 or 4 minutes, so feel free to skip forward. I'll put a little box on the screen that you can use to skip to the next section. Or watch it if you want. Now I hope it's not too dull to watch me do the rest of them, so I'm going to select the next letter, press Shift and D, Z and 10 to move it up 10. I'm going to rotate it by 10 degrees around its Y, make it a rigid body, go to the first frame and press play to simulate that. That looks great. So I'll just press F3, hit enter and enter again, just wait for the keyframes. I'm going to delete the last keyframe at frame 250, and then I'm going to add an empty, single arrow, Shift and click the letter and use the Align tool to move the empty to it. Now parent the letter to the empty, select just the empty, Shift and select the original letter, use the Align tool again to move them all over, and then I can just hide that letter. Press play and watch it all back, and that drops into place nicely. Now the next letter, just select it, press Shift and D, Z, 10. This This one I'm going to do -10 in Y. Make it a rigid body. Again, go to the first frame, press play to simulate it. That looks great, so press F3, enter, enter. Wait for the keyframes, delete the last one. Add our empty again. Move it to the position of our letter with the X, Y, and Z align tool. Select the letter, parent it to the empty, select the empty, and move that to the position of the original letter. Now I can hide that and just watch that play back. That looks great. Next letter. So select the A, the next letter, press Shift and D, press Z and 10 to move it up. Rotate this one around Y by 6. I'm going to make it a rigid body. Go to the first frame, press play, have a look at that. Again, that looks great, so just press F3, enter, enter, wait for the keyframes. Delete the last one again, press Shift and A to add an empty. Shift and select our letter and use the align tool. Now parent the letter again to the empty, select the empty, then the original letter and move those over. And I can hide the original A and we can watch that one back. That looks great. Let's do the next one. Select the G, Shift and D, Z, 10. Rotate this one by 10 degrees around X, make it a rigid body, go to the first frame, press play. That looks great. Press F3 and back to keyframes. Again, wait for the keyframes and delete the last one. Press Shift and A, add an empty, single arrow. Move that to the position of our letter. Parent those together, and then select just the empty and the original letter and move that over. I can now hide the original G and we can have a look at that back. And that looks great as well. Now the last letter, let's take our E, duplicate it and move it up. I'm going to rotate this one around X by 5 degrees. Make it a rigid body, and because it's cylindrical, a little like the O was, I'm going to change the collision shape to box. Go to the first frame and simulate that. Let's see how that looks. And that looks great. F3, back to keyframes. Delete the last keyframe, add the empty. Move it to the position of the letter. Parent the letter to the empty. Select the empty and move it to the position of the original letter. I can hide that and we should have a full animation. And that looks good, but all of the letters fall at the same time, so I like to select each letter and move its keyframes around in time. I select each letter in turn and go through its keyframes. I'm just going to leave the animation for the D alone. Let's move on to the R. I'll press A while I'm hovering over the keyframes in the timeline. Press G and just move them around. It doesn't really matter to where, anywhere is fine, as long as they don't intersect, so I keep checking the animation as I go, and that looks fine. So now I'll select the O, press A to make sure all of its keyframes are selected in the timeline, and just move that about. I don't know where to move it to, it doesn't really matter. Let's try there. Oh, and that looks good. I like the O falling down late. So now I'll select the P, press A on the timeline, press G, and just move that on a little way. And the O falls nicely between those, so that looks good. Let's try the next letter. Press A, press G, maybe I'll move it back. I think that happens too early, so let's move it forward. And that looks good. I think maybe it interferes with the A. So let's take the A, and I'm going to select all the keyframes for that. I'm going to move that a bit further down, somewhere about there. And I suppose that'll be the very last letter to finish. Let's try the G, press A to select everything, press G to move that, maybe I'll move that one back. No, I think that's going to interfere with the A, so I'm going to move that one forward. Let's move it quite far forward. Try that. And I just have to maybe orbit the camera around, make sure they're not intersecting as they fall. And that looks good. Last letter, I'll just select the E, just so that it doesn't land at the same time as everything else. I'm going to go to the first keyframe. I'm going to turn off the overlays for now, just so there's no clutter and I can have a look at that. And yeah, they all drop really randomly. I think that looks really good. So now we have this animation. I'm just going to turn overlays back on. But I'm going to turn off the selectability of the light and the camera for the next part. I don't want to be able to select those. What we want to do now is control the position of the entire animation and control its position with just one empty. And we'll see that doing this also allows us to make copies of the whole animation and retime those copies really quickly. So first of all, I just want to drag a selection box around everything. I'm going to press Shift and S and say cursor to selected, just to move the cursor in the middle of it all. Now I'm going to press Shift and A and add one more empty, another single arrow empty. But in this one I'm going to go over to the empty properties and I'm going to change its size to 2 meters, just so I can see which one's which. Now I'm just going to move the camera around a bit so that I can select all the other empties without selecting any of the mesh objects. and drag a box around all of those. Our new empty should still be the active one. Now I'm going to press Ctrl and P and say parent to those. Now we see that we just have our new empty as the only one and everything else is inside it, all of our animation. Now is a good time to rename this new empty. Actually, I'm going to call it droppage. And this empty now controls the whole thing. What I often like to do if I have lots of these is to go through each one of these, and in the empty's properties I change each one to be very small. We can't turn off their selectability, we do need them to be active, but if they're out of the way, that's the best way to do it. You do have to do this one by one as far as I know. If anybody else has a method to copy the size of empties very quickly, I'd love to hear it. I can now select this empty and move the entire animation around anywhere I want. If I just go to an animated frame, then maybe that would be more obvious. And I can move them anywhere I want. I'm just going to go over to overlays in the little menu. I'm going to turn off relationship lines because things can get a little messy on screen if we don't do that. But now, even better than that, if I have this empty selected and I press Shift and the close square bracket on the keyboard a couple of times, which just selects the children in a hierarchy, I can create a copy of the entire thing just by pressing Shift and D. If I now press Y on the keyboard and type -1 just to move it forward by 1 unit, we'll see that we have 2 versions of our animation. They're both happening at the same time, but this entire copy has all of its keyframes here, and this is the keyframes for every single letter displayed. If we press A to make sure they're all selected, I can press G and type 10 to move them on 10 frames. So now if we look at this animation, we'll see that everything is a lot more random. I can do that again. I can press Shift and D and move this one back 2 units. So I'll press Y and 2. You'll notice we can't see the keyframes for this one's animation, and that's just a bit of a bug in Blender's timeline. If you move your mouse into the timeline and just roll the mouse, then they'll all appear. So again, just press A to make sure they're all selected, and I'm going to move the keyframes for this one. I'll press G and type -20 so that this one starts earlier. Go to the first frame and have a look at that, and we'll see that we have this fairly random animation. Obviously it's not completely random, it's kind of choreographed by us. You would have seen that in the animation at the very start of this video. I'm not going to recreate that whole thing because it's quite boring watching me just make copies of these and retime the animation, but hopefully you can see that the process is very simple. But what I will show you is that it's very easy to change the materials of all of the objects. Again, if I select one of the empties and I press the Shift and the open square bracket just to make sure the whole hierarchy is selected, and then I shift and click on one of the meshes to make it the active object, we'll see that the material controls appear. And if I go in here and click on this number, it says 33. That means 33 other objects share this material. But if I click on it, that makes it a unique material. And then I can just change the color of that. I think I just made that black very simply. And then in the 3D view, I can press Ctrl and L and say link materials. And that copies the material to all of the meshes. The empties don't care whether they're selected or not. They don't care about materials. Let's do that again. I think for the middle one I made everything orange, so press Shift and the open square bracket just to make sure the whole hierarchy is selected. Shift and click one of the meshes to make it the active object. Click the little number next to the material's name, and I think I made that one, yeah, orange. I go into the 3D view, press Ctrl L and say link materials, and they all turn orange. And now we can have a look at the animation, play that back. And that looks great. It looks really random for very little effort, really. I'm going to leave camera controls and rendering and lighting for another tutorial, but hopefully you'll see that that's quite an interesting and useful technique. Now I really should get on making the king for our chess set.